All right, I'm recording. All right, other questions for chapter 10, guys? Oh, let's go over this, just because this comes up in the case study. So different types of hypoxia, okay? So again, this is a cause of cell injury. So what do we mean by hypoxia? Tells you, but. Right, if you look at the bottom, technically hypoxia just means low oxygen in the tissues, right? Just in general. Hypoxemia, low oxygen in the blood, right? And then if you're talking about ischemia, lack of blood flow. So if you're thinking about low oxygen in the tissues, obviously that means the cells in that tissue do not have enough oxygen, right? There's low oxygen levels there. So if you look at these different types, you should be familiar with them, right? So there's different reasons for the hypoxia here. So hypoxemic hypoxia, what's the reason there's not enough oxygen to the cells? Is it because there's a lack of blood flow?
Well, it says due to environmental reasons or respiratory disease, so maybe like the structure, something inhibiting.
Well, think about the respiratory disease part, right? So obviously if you have some sort of respiratory disease, right, it's affecting the lungs, right? And so if we're talking about what's the function of the lungs? Yeah. Right? So gas exchange, right? We're taking in oxygen, yeah? So the idea is if there's dysfunction of the lungs for some reason, there's not enough oxygen coming in, right? So even though the blood might be fine in terms of its oxygen carrying capacity, right? The blood flow to certain areas is fine. It's because of respiratory disease, there's not enough oxygen coming in, right? And so that can lead to hypoxia in general, yeah? Does that make sense? So the idea is that it is a respiratory issue that causes the decrease in oxygen, okay? So diseases, and again, in the first case study, the patient has COPD, respiratory disease, right? What does COPD affect? You guys know? What structure in the lungs is I guess there's kind of multiple things that are affected, but there's one thing in particular that's kind of specific to COPD, part of the lung that's affected. Where does actual gas exchange occur in the lung? Yeah, alveoli, right? And alveoli are these really thin, it's really basically thin epithelial tissue. And so those alveoli become damaged, and it's basically irreversible damage to those epithelial cells. And so gas exchange, really hard for gas exchange to occur, right? So that's primarily what's affected there. So in that case, again, just the oxygen levels in the blood in general are low, right? Therefore, body cells are not getting as much. So that's one example of a respiratory disease that would affect that. What about ischemic hypoxia? So what's an example of some sort of disease that's going to cause ischemic hypoxia? Yeah. Say it louder. Okay, you're right. So what'd you say, hyperlipidemia? So, right, if you have a buildup of lipids in your blood vessels, right, that then creates a blockage, okay, right. Then what ultimately, though, can that lead to? Heart attack, right? Or stroke, right? So those are all ischemic types of injuries, right, or diseases. And so they'll cause ischemic hypoxia. There's a lack of blood flow, right, to that area, or it says decreased perfusion, right, however you want to say it. And basically, that's why you're not getting enough oxygen, okay? So the lungs are fine. There's enough oxygen in the blood, but there's a blockage, yeah? If you talk about now anemic hypoxia, what's the problem there? Yeah. Good. The blood cells aren't able to efficiently carry the oxygen, right? So anemia, right? If you think about, sickle cell anemia, those red blood cells they're not shaped properly. They're not able to carry oxygen properly, right? Carbon monoxide poisoning. I talk about that in this lecture as well, right? What happens with carbon monoxide poisoning? Why is it so dangerous? What's the mechanism? Because I go through the whole thing. Go ahead. Yeah, you're right, kind of right. What do you mean by that? Yeah, so when the carbon monoxide binds to the hemoglobin, what then happens? What does that do to oxygen, I guess? Or how does that affect oxygen? Yeah, it basically binds to the same binding sites that oxygen would normally bind to on the hemoglobin, right? And so basically it leaves nowhere for the oxygen to bind. In actuality, actually, the few places that oxygen can bind end up being these really strong sites that, like, it's hard to unload the oxygen there. So even if some oxygen is being bound, it's not going to be unloaded. The bottom line is your body's deprived of oxygen, right? And so that carbon monoxide binds to the hemoglobin and forms something called carboxyhemoglobin. And it's basically irreversible. When it binds on there, it doesn't let go. So if you don't remove that patient from the source, right, and give them oxygen, depending on how long they've been exposed, it's going to lead to death pretty quickly, right? So super serious. All right, what's the last one there? Histoxic hypoxia. So the tissue or the cells themselves aren't able to use oxygen, right? The oxygen is not able to get into the cell. Well, maybe it can get into the cells, but basically the cell can't use that oxygen, right? So I think I give you an example about cyanide somewhere. Where did I talk about that? Somewhere. Anyway, cyanide interferes with kind of the cell's ability to produce ATP from oxygen, okay? So in this case, there's nothing wrong with the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. The lungs are functioning just fine. It's just that those cells are not able to utilize that oxygen, right? And so again, what do cells use oxygen for? Yeah, to produce energy, right? I mean, that's what the oxygen's there for. If there is no oxygen available, the cell's not able to produce these 36 to 38 ATP per glucose molecule, okay? So that's why it's super important. That's bottom line, yeah? All right, anything else? So like I said, those different types of hypoxia kind of have to do with that case study in chapter 8. Anything else you guys want me to go over here? Oh, I'll also say one other thing that has to do with the case study too. Oh, that's when I talked about, I think, carbon monoxide, or cyanide somewhere in here. Anyway, the case study also talks about the effects of like smoking, okay, on cells, right? Like what types of injuries will smoking sort of induce in cells, okay? So you can kind of think about that. If I look at the very long response that the textbook has to that question, they talk about epithelial and endothelial cells and stuff like that. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind. I don't know that you have to go crazy there, but it's the idea that if you're talking about smoking, right? Remember we talked about this? There are tons and tons of chemicals that are in that smoke, right? And those chemicals themselves act as toxins, right? And can affect cells, particularly the cells of your respiratory, airways, and then obviously the lungs, right? If you think about COPD is caused by smoking, that's pretty much it. Caused by other maybe pollutants like asbestos and stuff like that, but for the most part, COPD is caused by smoking cigarettes, right? And why? Because they end up damaging those alveoli, right? But also damaging other cells in those respiratory areas, these epithelial cells. All right, so anyway, I'll leave it at that. Let's do the case study. So what you guys are gonna do, okay, you guys divide yourselves into groups, keep yourselves as distant as you can. One person, have your computer on, you gotta pull up the case studies for chapter 10, open up that, what is it, unit 4, let me show you. You might already have it open. Yeah, so unit 4 case studies, right? All right, you guys on Zoom, I'm gonna divide you guys out into breakout rooms and you guys are gonna work on the case studies. So one person in the group needs to open a Google Doc, share it with me, share it with your group members, write your names of everyone in the group on the top of that Google Doc and work on the questions there, okay? That way I can see what you guys did. I can see what you're doing right now. I can also use it for attendance later on, okay? If somebody is in your group, obviously in here it's a little easier to please, but if somebody's in your group, when I put you in the breakout room, but they're not really doing anything, do not put their name on Google Doc, please, okay? Yeah. Chapter 10. Okay, so chapter 10 case studies, I'll pull them up. So get the chapter 10 case studies up, get your Google Doc ready. Like I said, share it with me, add everyone's names, and start working on them. So you're just gonna get as far as you can go. I'll leave time for us to go over them. You likely won't get through both, but that's fine. If you get through the first one, then move on to the second one. Okay, so start with Samuel Murphy. All right, you guys on Zoom, I'm going to divide you up. I'm gonna stop recording.